Hello, my name is Dr. Nick Bowman. I'm an associate professor at West Virginia University in the Department of Communication Studies. I'm going to talk a bit today about using the media as an educator, as a tool, not only for this information about the world, such as reading the newspaper, or reading magazine articles, or watching the television news, but actually using the media to teach people academic lessons. And so today we'll go over the history of that process and sort of where technology is taking us in terms of using our media as educational tools. Some things to consider for this presentation. Why have some traditionally avoided thinking about media as a learning mechanism? What is the difference between cognitive and effective learning? Why is it important to consider social learning processes when we talk about new media? Why might video games be different than other media in terms of learning processes associated with them? How can social media hurt or help the learning process? And of course, like most of our discussions, you're welcome to have these conversations on our Class E campus page. And we also might encourage you to go on Twitter and use the Media is Tools hashtag to answer some of our questions. So when we think about the media, one of the things we can think about in terms of media and education is the role that mass media and of course today's media communication has played in our lives over the last 100 or so years. So for example, by the 1960s, almost 97% of US homes had a television, and children were spending upwards of 27 hours a week in front of the TV. And for many folks, this was a bit different because it was one of the first times that children perhaps weren't getting the primary source of information about the world from their parents or their church leaders or their local library or other sort of more interpersonal type sources. And instead, they were getting it from mass broadcast. As George Gerbner put it, we'll read a lot about him later on in the book. He's one of the early media scholars. He said that those who tell stories have power in society. And for him in the 1960s, television was telling most of the stories to most of the people most of the time. And so on the one hand, this concerned people because it might be the case that watching television that's largely entertainment based might focus more on drama and sex and crime and maybe doesn't have a whole lot of educational lessons. But on the other hand, Gerbner doesn't really suggest that it's always going to be bad, but rather, at least if you read his comments carefully, he's just suggesting that television is a place where we get information. And so people started to wonder whether or not this television product, this leisure activity that people do in their own time, that apparently children, at least by the 60s and even further on, were spending so much time doing, that perhaps engaging that product for educational outcomes might be something that could be worthwhile and successful. So around the same time that Gerbner was writing his early theories on what he would come to be known as the cultivation theory scholar and talking about how television tells stories and people who watch a lot of television tend to believe those stories, we had Norman Minow, who was the FCC chairman, the Federal Communication Commission chairman. We talked about them last week, who went to the National Association of Broadcasters meeting and really chastised the leading network executives and talent and producers and called television a vast wasteland. And he made comments how, we have this tool that has an amazing power to reach people, reach them in their homes, reach them in their leisure time, reach them in their spare time when they're paying attention. And all we're doing is containing a lot of slapstick comedy, a lot of very disparaging comedy, racist comedy, overly sexual comedy, lots of very hard news about the Vietnam War, for example, very bloody, very dark. And I think Minow was more concerned with the comedy aspects than the news aspects. But one of the things he was trying to argue is that television's a bit of a joke. And he was saying it's a vast wasteland of intellectual emptiness to where we just have people sitting in front of a TV and their minds are rotting away. And he sort of challenged broadcasters to essentially do something better with their television programming. In fact, the SS Minnow from Gilligan's Island was sort of making fun of Norman Minnow and his vast wasteland speech. You can imagine that broadcasters at the time weren't very happy with the FCC chairman. He says something here that I admit I admire your courage, but that doesn't mean I would make your life easier. Your broadcast license let you use the public's airwaves as trustees for, at the time, 180 million Americans. And basically, he's calling out the broadcasters for being irresponsible. And of course, part of Minnow's speeches really fueled some of the early media research at the time. We'll talk about moral panic research later on in chapters 12 and 13. You can listen to Minno's speech. There's a connection to it on eCampus, and you can also download these slides and click the button for more information, including the text of the speech and the actual speech itself. And regardless of how we feel about Minno's views on television, it did get broadcasters thinking that maybe there's something more we can do with television programming than simply entertainment or simply sort of what we might call as lowbrow entertainment. In fact, TV journalist Michael Davis, who did a very interesting documentary and historical text on the birth of Sesame Street, he said, what if you could create content, television content, that was both entertaining and instructive? What if it went down more like ice cream than spinach? And what Davis is talking about here is that oftentimes education and entertainment are seen as qualitatively different things. That when you're learning something, like listening to this lecture, it's not very fun. And when you're watching TV, you're having a really good time, but you're not really learning anything. And so Davis and many others had wondered if we could make television programming that was both entertaining and educational. In fact, we saw two very big examples of this emerge in some ways out of the 1960s speeches and around Minno's talk and around these concerns that kids were spending a lot of time on TV. And so rather than just turning the television off, broadcasters thought, well, what if we just make television content that's maybe good for kids? You know, give them ice cream and it's actually spinach. So the two big ones were a focus on cognitive learning and effective learning. Cognitive learning would be a focus on knowledge acquisition, actually teaching students cognitive skills, abilities, and academic lessons. Effective learning with an A is a focus on personal development, teaching children to how to grow up and what it's like to have an imagination and to inspire them to be good people, to teach them about their emotions and their feelings and sort of the world around them. And of course, the two characters on screen you should hopefully recognize, although I realize I'm getting a bit old and these references aren't so popular anymore, but you've got Big Bird on the left from Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers on the right from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And I think these are wonderful examples of television programming that encourages cognitive learning and effective learning. In fact, on eCampus, I'd like you to log on, and one of the questions this week is going to ask you to tell me of other, maybe more modern examples of television programming that focuses on cognitive learning versus effective learning. And again, the key here is that they're entertainment programs. Both Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood were meant to be fun to watch. These weren't news programs or magazines. They were shows for kids that were fun and hopefully taught them something along the way. So cognitive learning is one of the biggest focuses. This was, could we use that time kids are spending at home and actually teach them something along the way? And so cognitive and this autotelic learning, that would be consuming something for its own purpose. We talked about this in an earlier chapter. This was thought to be key for what became known as the Children's Television Workshop. A group of scholars and educators and researchers and program executives thought, could we make a television show that's fun to watch? And for many of you who have watched it, they came up with Sesame Street, having identifiable characters, fun characters, little monsters and puppets and humans all living together, dealing sort of with various issues around the neighborhood, learning how to count, how to speak, and they also even learn how to grow up and some other effective processes. But the point here is that we already knew that kids were watching TV. And we know from educational research that whenever people do something in an autotelic manner, that is, they do it for its own motivation. There's no particular reward for watching Sesame Street. You don't get money or a grade or somehow rewarded for watching it. It's just fun to watch. Well, we found that Sesame Street actually did boost learning. Kids who were at home by themselves and they watched Sesame Street in their spare time as opposed to watching some other cartoon or some other show, they actually got smarter in school. They did better in school afterwards. However, one of the curious things about Sesame Street is that the influence of the program on children was what's called disordinal. In other words, it didn't match all kids. In fact, we saw that kids from higher, what's called socioeconomic status background, or SES, these would be kids from wealthier families, perhaps who have two parents who tend to live in relatively affluent neighborhoods and go to good schools, those kids actually got even smarter than the kids who watched Sesame Street and didn't come from high SES backgrounds. And this is kind of curious because on the one hand, Sesame Street definitely encouraged all of the kids to learn. In fact, the goal of the program was to close the learning gap. But what it actually did was increase the learning gap, although everybody got smarter. And one of the leading explanations behind this was the notion of SES, that kids from high SES backgrounds not only got to watch Sesame Street, but they also got to discuss it with their parents, and they watched it with their families, and they watched it with other kids. Where perhaps kids from low SES backgrounds, they watched Sesame Street, but they watched it by themselves. They didn't get to discuss it with their parents. Perhaps both parents were working multiple jobs to try to keep up with the times, and as a result, they didn't get to kind of reinforce the lessons. That being said, Sesame Street is considered one of the most important developments in education entertainment. It's a highly successful program, both commercially and academically. And with this study, we also found out the value of having a stable home to help kids learn throughout school. Of course, not all lessons for children are academic ones, because part of growing up is it's tough. You don't understand emotions. You don't understand love and death and divorce and war. And the world doesn't really stop just because you're a little kid. And so Mr. Rogers did one of the most interesting episodes I can possibly think of. And we've linked it on eCampus, and we've also linked it here if you want to watch it. But there's a famous episode called Death of a Pet, where Mr. Rogers comes home from work, he does his routine, he puts on his house shoes, puts on his cardigan, he goes to feed his fish, and he finds out the fish is dead. Something that kids would commonly experience. I mean, death is part of life, even if it's a pet. And he writes this song of, why does a dog have to bark? Why does an elephant die? Why can't we play all the time in the park? Why can't my pussycat fly? Why? I wonder why. And what is Mr. Rogers doing here? Well, essentially, he's trying to teach kids that it's okay to be sad, and he's trying to teach them how to deal and cope with loss. And the episode sort of walks kids through a relatively traumatic event. Go further, what we learn is that Mr. Rogers' goal on television was that he didn't like TV. He thought the stuff on TV was kind of trash. And he wondered, kind of like Dr. Minnow, or rather Chairman Minnow, the FCC, if there was a way to use this fabulous instrument to nurture those who would watch and listen. And so things like the Death of a Pet episode, or Mr. Rogers showing people factories or families, or talking about divorce, good and bad things. The whole point was to focus on children's personal growth and to give them a space where they could sort of experiment with their personalities and their realities and just learn about the world. As a kid, I used to watch the Mr. Rogers episode where they go to the crayon factory. In fact, if you download these slides, the giant purple crayon there is actually linked to the crayon factory video. Just showing kids how complex and cool the world can be was thought to sort of encourage them to think creatively about the world around them. Talking about divorce and war and death and families teaches kids that not everybody's the same and that there are other people going through some of those personal struggles. Again, it's a focus on personal growth that is often neglected, especially, for example, in the school, we're largely focused on teaching academic lessons. We don't often think about how to deal with more complicated issues. And so shows like Mr. Rogers became a place where kids could essentially learn how to be kids and also learn how to be adults. Again, you think back to that cultural heritage role of the mass media. Now, one of the reasons that media learning works so well is because we can observe it without doing it ourselves. And we often think, well, you have to do things to learn them. But as psychologist Albert Bandura would tell you, is that learning would be exceedingly laborious and probably even dangerous if the only way we could learn something is to actually do it ourselves. And we know that humans learn by witnessing their environment. So we're going to talk about the social learning theory, also called social cognitive theory, to focus more on the thoughts, because it's incredibly relevant to how we approach and understand these media learning. So some of the things Bandura talks about is that we learn from TV because it's a vicarious experience. In other words, we can watch somebody else do something, and we can kind of learn through their experiences, and it's something that humans are particularly good at. Bandura noticed that children learn by modeling behaviors, and oftentimes he would show kids content, and before they'd ever even actually practice what they were viewing, they would actually be able to model the behaviors. And the way that Bandura broke this down is by attention, viewing the content, retention, remembering the content, reproduction, trying to replicate the content, and finally, motivation, having a reason to actually do the thing they witnessed. And it's important to realize that Bandura was not a media scholar. He was trying to describe learning broadly, how kids on the playground learn to stand in line or learn to use the monkey bars or learn to talk to each other. He might suggest that kids learn aggression by the way their parents talk to each other. These aren't academic lessons. They're more just things you pick up in the world. As a personal example, I live in Germany 2 to 3 months a year. And I've learned a lot about German culture and German language, not by taking classes, but by just walking around the streets and seeing how folks interact with each other and then trying to mimic those behaviors. And one of the challenges I have for you is I want you to go to eCampus and tell me that of this process of attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation, at what point do you think learning has actually occurred? One of the more famous Bandura studies was called the Bobo doll study, and you can read about this online. We've also linked to it in other parts of the website, and you can do a Google search for Bandura and Bobo doll. But the way that he tested his theory is that he had children watch what he would consider attractive models of behavior and whether or not they're rewarded or punished. So on the top here, you see an adult punching up a Bobo doll, which is a doll meant for hitting and kicking. And what he would do is he would show kids these videos, and he would either have the adult rewarded or punished for hitting the doll. And then he would see what the kids would do after watching that video. And what he argued is the kids who watch the adults hit the doll and then also get rewarded or not punished for hitting the doll, well, they were more likely to play with it in the exact same way. Whereas if they saw somebody get punished for hitting a doll, they were less likely to do it. And so Bandura talked about how it's not that we model all behavior. We model behaviors that are rewarded or that aren't punished. And it's kind of how we learn about the world around us. And there's a fascinating series of studies here in the Bobo doll line, and we'll make those available to you online. As I mentioned earlier, he later renamed the theory to call it social cognitive theory to try to reflect sort of the thought processes rather than just the behavioral focus of learning. One of the reasons he talked about social cognitive theory is that we don't always actually learn the behaviors per se, but we can learn what's called behavioral scripts. In other words, I might watch a lot of television that shows people punching each other and being rewarded for punching. I may not necessarily go out and punch people, but what I've learned is to associate punching with strength and victory and not being punished for punching somebody. And so in my mind, I might associate punching and violence with reward and strength. And of course, the big question for you, which again, I'd like you to go to eCampus and answer, is does social cognitive theory suggest that children learn all witnessed behaviors? In other words, I want you to think carefully about that notion of witnessing plus witnessing consequences of behaviors. It's very important for the study of social learning and social cognitive theory generically, but also the study of media effects more specifically. Again, the basic model is the attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation stage. And so if we were to use a video game as an example, you might watch a video game played and see, in this case, Nico Bellic from Grand Theft Auto 4 shoot somebody through the shoulder. And you might retain that memory of shooting somebody as an important and rewarded part of a mission. And then you might actually try to reproduce that behavior. For example, in the Bobo doll study, where we see little Johnny here shooting Bobo with a gun. But the question often becomes, what is the motivation for doing it? And for example, in video games and in movies, you might see someone shoot somebody else, but that may not necessarily mean you've learned how to reproduce the behavior. Anybody who's handled a handgun can tell you that it's a bit more complicated than just picking up a controller and pushing the X button. And then, of course, once you've actually learned that mechanic or not, we might question why you would actually do it. So there are a lot of people who know how to shoot a handgun and who have played Grand Theft Auto, but there's also a lot of social and cultural lessons that kind of say, look, you can't just go around shooting people, even if you're mad at them. And this, in fact, is a major debate in media research today, because there are some that argue that consistently watching these media programs teaches you to associate, for example, aggression and violence and victory with guns, which might cause you to shoot people. And there are other folks that say that just because you see a shooting on TV doesn't mean you're actually learning how to shoot a gun. And even if you are learning how to shoot a gun, they don't necessarily teach you how to overcome the different barriers, both legally and ethically, that would lead you to actually shoot somebody. It's a major question that's open to interpretation, and I'd like you to tell me, using social learning theory and social cognitive theory, do you think that playing a video game could teach you how to both reproduce shooting and motivate you to shoot somebody? And I'd really be curious to hear your thoughts, and we'll talk about these in more detail in chapters 12 and 13. Now, we do know that, for example, with video games and learning, what makes them unique is that they're interactive, right? And as I was going back to that last slide, I was thinking to myself, well, the big difference between watching a shooting on TV and enacting one yourself is that in the video game, you're the one actually doing the behavior. You're the one that's actually being aggressive. We know that in 2010, which is 5 years ago now, almost 70% of households played games on a regular basis. We know that from some scholars, video games are a ubiquitous part of childhood. They're just sort of what we do as kids now. They're just a part of our childhood, like, hanging out with family, going to school, and eating McDonald's, if you want to argue this. And so we wonder if we might learn from games, for better or for worse, even stronger, because the games are interactive. That is, it's no longer observational learning, but perhaps it's actually hands-on interactive and active behavioral learning. A couple examples might be like the Legend of Zelda, and I realize this example might be sort of far beyond the experience of many of the students listening to me today. But if you were to click on this link or download this, just do a Google search for Zelda World Map, you'll see this very complex map of the Kingdom of Hyrule. And one of the points I often make with this example is that for many of us, like when I was a little kid, I memorized that map forwards, backwards, left, and right, where I can almost blindly walk through Zelda. And even today, I can tell you where every single sword, arrow, monster, hidden bush, hidden passage, maze is and how to navigate it. Yet, as a kid, I couldn't navigate my neighborhood, or I would get lost on the way home from the woods. And what we joke about is that video games require you to learn. You know, the legend literally of Zelda. As you play the game, you learn the map. And you didn't necessarily intend to set out and learn the map of Hyrule, the map in the game Zelda, but you don't have an option because in order to play the game and in order to make the decisions you need to make to beat the game, you have to learn the map. It's a great example of autotelic learning, or sort of like secondary learning, where your primary goal is to experience the video game and have fun playing it. And then this kind of interesting secondary, indirect, and unintended effect is that you end up learning spatial recognition and navigation abilities along the way. And of course, I would love for you to go to eCampus and tell me, have you had learning experiences from video games that perhaps you didn't even realize you were learning as you were playing? But this is often spoken of as one of the most powerful aspects of gameplay. In fact, many scholars, such as educational psychologist James Gee, argue that gaming is learning sort of by definition, just like play is learning by definition. Here's a longer version of that map I was just telling you about. It's pretty complex, right? But you ask almost any child in their 30s, I guess I sometimes do behave as a kid. What you end up finding out is that if we played Zelda to this day, we've probably memorized this map in the back of our heads. And it may not look complex to some of you in the audience who play video games today, but for a child of the 80s, this was a remarkably complex map with different rich narrative worlds, and each different decision you made was incredibly important. If you didn't beat the monsters in the right order, if you went to a monster before finding its secret weapon or its weakness, you were going to have a bad time. So it was really important for you to really understand where you're going. Kind of like in life, it helps to know your city. We also might think of social media programs because what they do is they allow these digital natives to learn from each other in spaces that might be natural to their social interaction. What's a digital native? Well, it's probably you. These are people who were sort of born into a world to where technology is kind of ever present, to where, television screens and tablets and smartphones and social media have just sort of always been around you. I didn't use social media until I was in graduate school because it didn't exist until I was in graduate school. Yet my little brother was able to access Facebook in high school. And the argument here is that social media gathers people and it connects them and it communicates them in ways that we couldn't do before. And if you're able to talk to each other about issues, for example, we have the Facebook page for this class, you're able to communicate more. Now, that's not always good. One of the drawbacks is that Facebook usage, for example, for a student, is incredibly distracting, right? You go online, watch cat videos, watch, football highlights, watch beauty pageants, world politics, you name it. But anytime you're not studying, you're not paying attention. It's called the displacement hypothesis. Simply, we can't be in two places at once. So right now, if you've got this video open, but you're also reading ESPN.com or reading BuzzFeed, that means you're not paying attention to the lecture, right? Of course, one of the benefits is that not all of our social media usage is so blunt. I know from my own research that using Facebook groups, for example, that are specifically related to a topic or a class can increase cognitive and effective learning. And in fact, I'd like you to think about why that would be. So before you cheat and read the study, which is made available online, how do you think that a Facebook group that's class or topic specific could actually increase cognitive and effective learning? As I've kind of already said, we often argue that video games are sort of inherently educational because they're interactive. You have to touch the content, which means you have to learn the content. They're multimodal. Games require you to take visual information, audio information, textual information. We know from research in the educational psychologist realm that different people learn through different modalities, different types of content. Well, games often by their nature incorporate lots of content. They tend to be simulations of reality, or at least some games can be. My favorite is pictured here. It's called the Oregon Trail. It was invented in, oh my gosh, the late 70s. It's still playable today. And it was an interactive way of teaching kids about the trials and tribulations of going down the Oregon Trail in the 1800s. You had to ration goods, hunt for food, fight disease, cross the river, navigate the trail, avoid enemies. And the idea behind this game was that it was supposed to not so much teach you physically how to memorize the Oregon Trail's route, but rather teach you about the experience of going down the Oregon Trail. We call these games often serious games, and they're games that are designed to teach a particular academic lesson. Although increasingly today, serious games have also referred to games that teach cultural or social lessons as well. Another really cool advancement in technology, social media, and learning is the notion of the MOOC. It's the Massive Open Online Course. And this kind of takes all the elements of Web 2.0 and puts them into a pot together and combines them with these notions of not necessarily entertainment education, but these autotelic, self-motivating processes. Now, on eCampus, we've actually linked you to a MOOC that the Department of Communication Studies did very recently. The idea behind the MOOC is that you invite people to enroll in a college class. So you don't charge them any money. They don't get any grades or any certificate for it. It's simply meant to be a space for extended learning. People who just want to know more, for example, in this case, what the heck is communication technology? I've heard about this thing. My kids use it. My grandkids use it. My parents use it. I don't understand it. It's a way to provide education to people in their own spare time. And now it's not meant to replace college or replace high school and replace degrees and certifications. What it does do is it gives people legitimate academic content, in this case vetted by professors at a university, and it gives it to them sort of on their own time. And it's a way to introduce people to potentially important world issues. And I would actually encourage you guys to look through the MOOC and maybe tell us what you think about it, what you think your parents would think about it. Is it a useful activity or is it a distracting activity? And how does learning from MOOCs represent learning from the media or not learning from the media? So in summary, communication technology has played a prominent role in education, and in fact, it often has. I mean, if you think about it, textbooks and pencils were examples of communication technology of their day. And as technologies become more participatory, more Web 2.0, we see more information from the crowd. And today's audiences have access to much more than ever before. And so these things become incredibly important. It says news audiences here, but what we could think about there is entertainment audiences and how they might be incredibly compelled to seek out content that in a way actually teaches them similar to what the news would teach you about the world events. As always, we invite you to go online, and I'd like you to tell us, perhaps using the media as tools hashtag or the Facebook group. What lessons do you remember learning from Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers or children's programs? Have you ever used a video game for learning? And do you use Facebook for any classes? And if you do you find it helpful or does it get in the way and distract you from your education? As again, thanks always for your help, and we'll see you in the next chapters.